The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the marble floor of Pempton's equestrian auction house as Garrison. Caldwell adjusted his platinum cufflinks and surveyed the room with the confidence of a man who had never been told no. At 45, the tech mogul had accumulated enough wealth to buy small countries, and tonight he intended to add the crown jewel of American horseflesh to his collection. "Ladies and gentlemen," the auctioneer's voice boomed through the hushed gallery, "we present Midnight's Thunder, a 17-hand Frisian stallion with bloodlines tracing back to the royal stables of the Netherlands." The magnificent black horse entered the ring, his coat gleaming like polished obsidian under the spotlights. His mane flowed like liquid silk, and his eyes held an intelligence that seemed almost human. The crowd murmured in appreciation, but Garrison's attention was fixed on the animal with the intensity of a predator sizing up prey. "Bidding starts at $50,000. The auctioneer announced. Garrison didn't even lift his paddle. Such amounts were pocket change to him. He watched with amusement as lesser bidders fell away one by one, their financial limits exposed, like raw nerves. The price climbed steadily, 75,000, 100,000, 150,000. Then, from the back corner of the room, a weathered hand slowly raised a simple wooden paddle. The crowd turned to see a man in his 60s wearing a faded denim shirt and work boots that had seen better decades. His face was carved by sun and wind, his hands calloused from honest labor. This was Jeremiah Holloway, a small-time farmer from Wyoming whose presence in such an elite establishment seemed as unlikely as snow in July. 160,000, Jeremiah called out in a voice that carried the quiet authority of someone who had spent his life speaking to animals. Rather than boardrooms, a ripple of whispers swept through the crowd. Garrison's perfectly manicured eyebrows rose slightly, more in curiosity than concern. He'd seen plenty of wannabes who overextended themselves at auctions, caught up in the moment only to face financial ruin later. 200,000, Garrison countered without hesitation, his voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade. Jeremiah's eyes met his across the room. There was something in that gaze, not defeat, but a quiet determination that made Garrison's smile falter for just a moment. The farmer had studied this horse for months, had driven 18 hours straight to be here, and had mortgaged everything he owned for this one chance. 250,000, Jeremiah responded, his voice steady despite the fact that he was now betting his farm, his future, and his granddaughter's college fund on this moment. The crowd held its collective breath. Garrison's laugh echoed through the marble halls, sharp and dismissive. "This is rich," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "A dirt farmer thinks he can play with the big boys." He turned to his associates, his voice dripping with condescension. "Someone should tell him this isn't a livestock auction in some backwater county fair." But Jeremiah wasn't looking at Garrison anymore. His eyes were locked on Midnight's Thunder, and something extraordinary was happening. The stallion had stopped his restless pacing and was staring directly at the old farmer. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, man and horse regarded each other across the crowded room. Then, slowly, deliberately, Midnight's Thunder lowered his magnificent head in what could only be described as a bow. The entire auction house fell silent. The silence stretched across the auction house like a held breath. Even the auctioneer, a man who had presided over countless sales and thought he'd seen everything, found himself speechless. Midnight's Thunder remained in his respectful bow, his noble head lowered toward Jeremiah Holloway, as if recognizing something invisible to the rest of the room. Garrison's laughter died in his throat. the confident smirk that had been his trademark. Expression for decades melted away, replaced by confusion and something he rarely experienced, uncertainty. He looked around the room, expecting to find the source of some elaborate trick, but every face reflected the same bewildered awe. What the hell just happened? Garrison muttered to his assistant, Vivian Blackthorne, who stood beside him with her tablet and perfectly pressed suit. I don't know, sir, Vivian whispered back, her usual composure cracking. The horse just bowed. Jeremiah, meanwhile, felt his heart hammering against his ribs. He had hoped, prayed even, but he hadn't dared to truly believe until this moment. 27 years ago, he had been a different man, younger, prouder, and working as a horse trainer for wealthy clients across the country. It was at the Pemberton estate in Kentucky where he had first encountered a spirited young colt, barely 2 years old, with eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of ages. The colt had been wild, untamable by conventional methods. 3 trainers had given up on him before Jeremiah arrived. But something in the young farmer's approach, patience instead of force, respect instead of dominance, had reached the animal. Over 6 months, Jeremiah had worked with the colt, not breaking him, but building a partnership built on mutual trust. Easy Thunder, Jeremiah had whispered during their first successful ride, feeling the powerful muscles beneath him moving in perfect harmony with his guidance. You and I, we understand each other, don't we? The colt had responded by turning his head back toward Jeremiah, and in that moment, a bond was forged that transcended the typical relationship between human and horse. They had developed their own language of subtle gestures, soft sounds, and mutual respect. But then came the day that changed everything. Financial troubles had forced Jeremiah to sell his training business. The colt, now registered as Midnight's Thunder, had been sold to a breeding program. Jeremiah had watched through tears as the horse trailer disappeared down the dusty road, carrying away not just a valuable animal, but a piece of his soul. I'll find you again, boy, he had promised. The empty horizon. Someday, somehow, I'll find you. Now, standing in this gilded auction house, surrounded by people who measured worth in dollars and cents, Jeremiah felt that same connection reaching across the years. Thunder recognized him, remembered him, and was showing the entire room that true value couldn't be measured by the numbers on a bank statement. The auctioneer cleared his throat, struggling to regain control of the situation. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a bid of $250,000. Do I hear 500,000? Garrison interrupted, his voice sharp with irritation. The horse's behavior had unsettled him, but he wasn't about to let some farmer make him look foolish in front of his peers. Jeremiah's face went pale. He had stretched his resources to their absolute limit just to reach 250,000. His small farm, his equipment, his life savings, everything was already pledged against his current bid. He couldn't go higher, not without destroying everything he had worked for over the past 3 decades. But as he looked into Thunder's eyes, still watching him with that profound recognition, Jeremiah knew he couldn't give up. Not when they had found each other again after all these years. 550,000, Jeremiah said quietly, his voice barely audible but carrying to every corner of the now silent room. The crowd gasped. Vivian Blackthorne pulled out her phone, rapidly typing commands to verify the farmer's financial credentials. What she found made her eyes widen in disbelief. Sir, she whispered urgently to Garrison, his credit check shows he's mortgaged everything, his farm, his equipment, even his house. He's betting his entire life on this horse. Garrison studied Jeremiah's weathered face. seeing for the first time not a foolish old man, but someone driven by something deeper than money or pride. The tech mogul had built his fortune on reading people, on understanding their motivations and weaknesses. What he saw in Jeremiah Holloway was neither weakness nor foolishness, but a kind of desperate love that he had never experienced himself. For the first time in his adult life, Garrison Caldwell found himself genuinely uncertain about what to do next. The tension in the auction house was palpable as Garrison wrestled with an unfamiliar emotion doubt. His entire life had been built on the simple principle that everything had a price, and he had always been the one with the deepest pockets. But something about this moment, about the way Midnight's Thunder continued to watch Jeremiah with unwavering attention, made him question whether money was the only currency that mattered. 600,000, Garrison announced, his voice lacking its earlier confidence. Jeremiah closed his eyes, feeling the weight of impossible mathematics crushing down on him. He had already committed everything he owned and then some. His granddaughter, Paisley's college fund, the small inheritance from his late wife Cordelia, even the advance on next year's crop, all of it was already pledged to reach his current bid, but Thunder hadn't moved. The magnificent stallion remained focused on Jeremiah, occasionally snorting softly as if trying to communicate across the distance between them. Other horses in the holding area behind the ring had begun to grow restless, sensing the unusual energy in the room, but Thunder was completely still, completely focused. "I remember you too, boy," Jeremiah whispered, his words lost in the vastness of the auction hall, but somehow reaching their intended recipient. Thunder's ears pricked forward, responding to the familiar voice that had once guided him through his wildest days. The memories came flooding back to Jeremiah with startling clarity. He remembered the morning he had first seen Thunder's mother, a prize-winning mare named Celestial Dream, giving birth in the pristine stables of the Pemberton estate. The foal had been larger than expected, struggling to find his legs while his mother nicked softly, encouraging him to stand. "He's going to be something special," Jeremiah had told the estate manager that day. "Look at those eyes. He's got an old soul," and he had been right. As Thunder grew, he displayed an intelligence that set him apart from other horses. He could open gate latches, seemed to understand complex verbal commands, and showed an uncanny ability to read human emotions. More than once, Jeremiah had found the young horse offering comfort to other animals in distress, gently nuzzling a sick foal or standing protectively over an injured barn cat. But it was Thunder's relationship with Jeremiah that had truly been extraordinary. The horse had learned to respond to the slightest gesture, the softest whistle, even the way Jeremiah shifted his weight in the saddle. They had developed a communication that went beyond training, beyond the typical bond between human and animal. "He's not just a horse," Jeremiah had told his wife Cordelia one evening as they watched Thunder grazing in the moonlight. "He's a partner, a friend. Sometimes I think he understands me better than most people do." Cordelia had smiled, recognizing the deep love in her husband's voice. "Then you better make sure nothing ever comes between you two," she had said. Words that now seemed prophetic. The day Jeremiah had been forced to sell his training business remained one of the most painful memories of his life. He had stood in Thunder's stall, trying to explain to the young horse why he had to leave, why they couldn't be together anymore. "I failed you, boy," he had whispered, his tears falling in two. "Thunder's mane. I promised I'd always take care of you, and I failed." Thunder had responded by resting his great head against Jeremiah's chest, as if trying to offer comfort even as his own world was about to change forever. Now, 27 years later, that same gesture of connection was playing out in front of hundreds of strangers. Thunder hadn't forgotten. Despite years of different owners, different trainers, different environments, the horse remembered the man who had treated him not as property but as family. Garrison watched this silent communication between man and horse with growing fascination. He had owned dozens of horses over the years, spending millions on bloodlines and training, but he had never witnessed anything like this. His horses were investments, status symbols, beautiful creatures that won ribbons and impressed his friends, but they had never looked at him the way Thunder was looking at Jeremiah. "Sir," Vivian prompted quietly, "the bid is at 600,000. Are you going higher?" Garrison found himself studying Jeremiah's face, seeing the quiet desperation. There, the love that was willing to risk everything for a chance at reunion. For the first time in his life, the tech mogul wondered if there were things in this world that money couldn't buy and whether those might be the things that mattered most. The auctioneer's voice cut through his thoughts. "I have $600,000 going once." Time seemed to suspend itself as every person in the room waited to see if the farmer would find some way to continue fighting. The auctioneer's gavel hovered in the air like a sword of Damocles, ready to fall and sever the connection between Jeremiah and Thunder forever. The old farmer stood frozen, his weathered hands gripping the wooden paddle so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Mathematics was a cruel master, and no amount of love could change the harsh reality of numbers. "Going twice, ... the auctioneer announced, his voice echoing through the marble halls. Jeremiah's heart shattered as he watched Thunder's ears swivel toward the sound. The intelligent animal sensing that something momentous was about to happen. The horse took a step forward, as close to the barrier as he could get, his dark eyes never leaving Jeremiah's face in that moment. Memories flooded through Jeremiah's mind like a river breaking through a dam. He remembered teaching Thunder to trust, spending hours in the paddock simply sitting and letting the young horse approach on his own terms. He remembered the first time Thunder had allowed him to place a saddle on his back, the way the horse had trembled not with fear but with anticipation. He remembered their first ride together, when Thunder had moved beneath him with such grace and power that Jeremiah had felt like they were flying. "I can't," Jeremiah whispered to himself, his voice breaking. "I can't do this to my family." But then Thunder did something that made the entire room gasp. The stallion began to move closer to the barrier, his movements deliberate and purposeful. When he reached the edge of the ring, he lifted his front hooves and placed them on the rail, stretching his neck as far as he could toward Jeremiah whinnying, softly in a sound that seemed to carry all the longing of their 27 years apart. Vivian Blackthorne felt tears spring to her eyes, despite her professional composure. Even the other bidders, hardened business people who had attended countless auctions, found themselves moved by the raw emotion playing out before them. Garrison watched this display with growing unease. He had built his empire by being ruthless, by taking what he wanted without regard for the feelings of others. But something about this moment made him feel like a villain in a story where he had always seen himself as the hero. "The bid stands at $600,000, the auctioneer continued, clearly struggling with his own emotions. "Going twice to bidder number 40-7... Thunder's whinny grew more urgent, more desperate. The horse began to pace along the barrier, his eyes never leaving Jeremiah's face. It was as if he understood exactly what was happening, as if he knew that these might be the last moments he would ever see the man who had been his first and truest friend. Jeremiah felt something break inside his chest. He thought about his granddaughter Paisley, about the college fund he had already mortgaged, about the farm that had been in his family for 4 generations. He thought about the responsibility he had to his community, to the farmhands who depended on him for their livelihoods. But then he looked at Thunder, really looked at him, and saw not just a horse, but a soul that had been searching for home for nearly 3 decades. In that moment, Jeremiah realized that some things were worth more than financial security, more than practical concerns, more than the fear of what others might think. 700,000, Jeremiah called out, his voice stronger than it had been all evening. The crowd erupted in whispers and gasps. Vivian's fingers flew over her tablet, pulling up financial records that showed Jeremiah Holloway had just bid an amount that exceeded his total net worth by more than $2,000. "Sir," she whispered urgently to Garrison, "he can't possibly cover that bid. He's bidding money he doesn't have." Garrison stared at Jeremiah, seeing something in the old farmer's eyes that he had never seen in any of his business dealings. Love so pure and desperate that it was willing to risk everything, even destruction, for a chance at redemption. Thunder's response to Jeremiah's bid was immediate and profound. The stallion reared up on his hind legs, his front hooves pawing, the air in what could only be described as joy. When he came down, he bowed again, deeper this time, his muzzle nearly touching the ground in a gesture of such gratitude and recognition that several people in the audience began to openly weep. The auctioneer looked around the room, then focused on Garrison. "The bid is $700,000. "Do I hear $1 million? Garrison interrupted, his voice flat and emotionless. The words hit Jeremiah like a physical blow. He staggered backward, feeling the weight of defeat settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. There was no way, no possible way, he could match such a bid. The dream was over. After 27 years of hoping, of searching, of never quite forgetting, he was going to lose Thunder again. But as Jeremiah looked at the magnificent horse one last time, preparing to say goodbye forever, he saw something in Thunder's eyes that made him pause. It wasn't defeat he saw there, but a message of communication as clear as if the horse had spoken aloud. "Trust me," those dark eyes seemed to say. "Have faith." The $1 million bid hung in the air like a death sentence. Jeremiah felt his legs wobble beneath him, the crushing weight of financial impossibility settling on his shoulders. He had already bid money he didn't have, had already committed to financial ruin for a chance at this reunion, but $1 million might as well have been $1 billion. It was a sum that existed in a realm so far beyond his reach that he couldn't even begin to comprehend it. Thunder's reaction to Garrison's bid was immediate and devastating. The magnificent stallion's head drooped, his ears flattened against his skull, and he backed away from the barrier with what could only be described as heartbreak in his eyes. For a moment, the horse stood completely still, as if processing the cruel mathematics of the situation. Then, slowly, he turned his back on the crowd and began to walk toward the exit gate. "No, boy, wait," Jeremiah called out, his voice cracking with emotion. Thunder stopped but didn't turn around. His entire body language spoke of defeat, of a hope that had been kindled only to be extinguished once again. The auctioneer cleared his throat, preparing to finalize the sale, when an elderly woman rose from her seat in the front row. She was elegantly dressed, with silver hair pulled back in a perfect chignon and jewelry that spoke of old money and older taste. This was Beatrice Pemberton, heiress to the Pemberton fortune and the last surviving member of the family that had built this auction house. "If I may," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. I would like to address the room before this sale is completed." The auctioneer, clearly flustered, looked to the auction house management. After some quick, whispered consultation, he nodded. "The floor recognizes Mrs. Pemberton." Beatrice walked slowly to the center of the room, her cane tapping against the marble floor. She was 83 years old, but her eyes were sharp and clear as she looked around the crowded auction house. "Many of you know me," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed room. "You know my family built this business on the principle that great horses deserve great homes. What you may not know is that I have been following the story of Midnight's Thunder for many years, ever since he left our breeding program 27 years ago." She turned to look directly at Jeremiah, her gaze intense and knowing. "I remember a young trainer named Jeremiah Holloway who came to work with a difficult colt that everyone else had given up on. I watched from my window as this man spent months not breaking that horse, but building a relationship with him. I saw something I had never seen before, partnership built on mutual respect and genuine love." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Garrison shifted uncomfortably, sensing that the narrative was about to take a turn he hadn't anticipated. When financial circumstances forced Mr. Holloway to sell his training business, Beatrice continued, "I made a decision that I have regretted every day since. I allowed Midnight's Thunder to be sold to a breeding program that treated him as nothing more than a commodity. I told myself it was just business, that the horse would be well cared for. But I was wrong." She paused, gathering her strength for what came next. "Over the years, I kept track of Thunder's whereabouts. I watched as he was sold from owner to owner, each one seeing only his monetary value, none of them understanding his true nature. I watched a magnificent, intelligent animal become increasingly withdrawn, increasingly disconnected from the humans around him. Thunder had stopped moving toward the exit and was now listening intently, his ears pricked forward as if he recognized something in the old woman's voice. 3 months ago," Beatrice continued, "I made a decision. I arranged for Midnight's Thunder to be put up for auction, knowing that word would somehow reach Mr. Holloway. I hoped no, I prayed that he would come here tonight." Jeremiah stared at her in shock. You knew I would be here." "I hoped you would be," Beatrice replied, her voice gentle but firm, "because I wanted to right a wrong that has haunted me for 27 years. I wanted to see that magnificent horse reunited with the one person who truly understood him." She turned to face Garrison, her expression hardening slightly. "Mr. Caldwell, you are a wealthy man, and I'm sure you would provide adequate care for Midnight's Thunder. But adequate care is not the same as love. It's not the same as understanding. It's not the same as the bond that exists between a man and the horse he raised from a wild colt to a trusted partner." Garrison found himself speechless, unable to formulate the cutting response that usually came so easily to him. "Therefore," Beatrice announced, her voice rising with authority, "I am withdrawing Midnight's Thunder from this auction. The horse will be sold privately for the sum of $1 to Mr. Jeremiah Holloway." The room erupted in gasps and whispers. Garrison shot to his feet, his face flushed with anger. "You can't do that. This is a legitimate auction. I've placed a winning bid." Beatrice smiled, and there was steel in that smile. "Mr. Caldwell, I own this auction house, and I own this horse. I can do exactly as I please." She walked over to Thunder, who had turned back toward the center of the ring at the sound of her announcement. The horse lowered his head, allowing her to stroke his neck with hands that remembered him from his youth. "Besides," she added, looking directly at Garrison, "some things in this world are not for sale. Some bonds cannot be broken by money, and some loves cannot be bought at any price. Thunder's eyes found Jeremiah across the room, and for the first time since the bidding began, the horse's tail swished with what could only be described as joy. The private sale took exactly 3 minutes to complete. Beatrice Pemberton's lawyers, who had been waiting in the wings as if they had expected this moment, produced the necessary paperwork with remarkable efficiency. Jeremiah signed his name with a trembling hand, still unable to fully comprehend that after 27 years, Thunder was finally coming home. "Mrs. Pemberton," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I don't know how to thank you. Why would you do this for me? For us?" The elderly woman's eyes softened as she watched Thunder being led toward them. "Because, Mr. Holloway, I've spent my entire life around horses, and I've never seen anything like what you two shared. I've seen expensive horses and prize-winning bloodlines, but I've never seen a bond that transcended the ordinary relationship between human and animal. That kind of connection is sacred, and it was wrong of me to allow it to be broken in the first place." Garrison stood frozen in the center of the room, his $1 million bid rendered meaningless by an act of grace he had never imagined possible. His associates had gathered around him, murmuring words of consolation and legal options, but their voices seemed to come from very far away. For the first time in his adult life, Garrison Caldwell had been outmaneuvered, not by superior wealth or cunning business tactics, but by something he had never learned to recognize: love. Thunder approached Jeremiah slowly, as if afraid this might be another dream that would dissolve upon waking. The horse's steps were careful, measured, his dark eyes never leaving Jeremiah's face. When they were finally close enough to touch, both man and horse seemed to hold their breath. Jeremiah reached out his weathered hand, letting it hover inches from Thunder's muzzle. "Hello, old friend," he whispered. "I told you I'd find you again." Thunder closed the distance between them, pressing his soft nose into Jeremiah's palm. The contact sent a shockwave of recognition through both of them, and suddenly the years melted away. Thunder began to nicker softly, the same sound he had made as a young colt when Jeremiah would visit his stall in the early morning hours. "I know, boy," Jeremiah said, his voice breaking as he stroked Thunder's neck. "I know, I missed you too." The reunion was so intimate, so profound, that the remaining crowd began to disperse, sensing they were witnessing something too private for public consumption. But Garrison remained, transfixed by the display of pure emotion playing out before him. Vivian Blackthorne touched her boss's arm gently. "Sir, should we go?" Garrison didn't respond immediately. He was watching as Thunder performed his bow once more, but this time it was different. This wasn't a gesture of recognition or greeting. It was a gesture of gratitude, of joy, of homecoming. The horse held the position for a long moment, as if savoring the moment, before straightening and touching his forehead to Jeremiah's chest. "Sir," Vivian prompted again. "I... Garrison started, then stopped. He was struggling with emotions he didn't have names for, feelings that his wealth and success had never prepared him to handle. "I think I understand now," he said finally. "Understand?" "What, sir? Why I lost tonight?" He looked at Vivian, and she was surprised to see not anger in his eyes, but something that might have been wisdom. "I thought I was bidding on a horse, but they weren't selling a horse. They were selling the chance to reunite two souls who belonged together." As Jeremiah led Thunder toward the exit, the horse's head held high and his step light with joy. Garrison found himself following at a distance. Outside the auction house, he watched as Jeremiah loaded Thunder into a modest horse trailer that had seen better days but was clean and well maintained. "Mr. Holloway," Garrison called out, approaching cautiously. Jeremiah turned, his expression wary but not hostile. "Mr. Caldwell, I wanted to apologize," Garrison said, the words feeling strange in his mouth. "I mocked you in there. I thought you were foolish for bidding money you didn't have on a horse you couldn't afford." "Was foolish," Jeremiah replied simply, "but sometimes foolish is the only way to follow your heart." "I've spent my entire life believing that everything had a price," Garrison continued, "but tonight I learned that some things are priceless, and some things can only be earned through love, not bought with money." Thunder watched this exchange with interest, his ears pricked forward as if he understood every word. "I hope you'll both be very happy," Garrison said, and for the first time in years, he meant something with his whole heart. As Jeremiah's truck pulled away from the auction house, Thunder's head visible through the trailer window, Garrison stood in the parking lot and watched until the taillights disappeared into the night. Something had changed in him during those few hours in the auction house, something fundamental and irreversible. 6 months later, Thunder grazed peacefully in a Wyoming pasture, his coat gleaming in the morning sun. At 29, he was past his prime riding years, but his eyes held the contentment of a soul finally at peace. Jeremiah sat on the fence nearby, watching his old friend with the satisfaction of a man who had kept a promise that had taken nearly 3 decades to fulfill. The farm was smaller. Now he'd had to sell some acreage to cover the costs of Thunder's care, but it was home. And sometimes, when the morning light hit the pasture just right, Jeremiah would see Thunder lift his head and bow slightly toward the house, as if saying thank you for the 1,000th time. In the end, the millionaire's laughter had been silenced, not by defeat, but by the recognition that true wealth couldn't be measured in dollars and cents. It could only be measured in the depth of love, the strength of loyalty, and the sacred bonds that connect souls across time and circumstance. And in a pasture in Wyoming, where the grass grew green and the horizon stretched endlessly in all directions, a farmer and his horse had finally found their way home.